The humid Cincinnati evening hung heavy over Findlay Market, where the aroma of bratwurst and kettle corn mixed with the distant sounds of traffic on Race Street. Pete Rose sat alone at a corner table in Murphy's Tavern, a modest Irish pub tucked between a vintage record store and a bicycle repair shop. The establishment had seen better days. Its green vinyl booths were cracked with age, and the neon Budweiser sign flickered intermittently above the bar. Pete adjusted his Cincinnati Reds cap, pulling it low over his graying hair. At 73, the former baseball legend carried the weight of decades on his shoulders, both the glory and the controversy that had defined his life. His weathered hands wrapped around a half-empty bottle of Miller Lite, condensation pooling on the scarred wooden table beneath it. The tavern buzzed with its usual Tuesday night crowd, construction workers still in their paint-splattered clothes, a few college students from the University of Cincinnati nursing cheap beers, and several middle-aged locals who treated Murphy's like their second home. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of Cincinnati's sports heroes, including a prominent black-and-white image of Pete himself sliding headfirst into home plate during his record-breaking career. Behind the bar, 60-year-old Maggie O'Brien polished glasses with practiced efficiency. Her Irish accent had softened during her 30 years in Cincinnati, but it still colored her words when she spoke to regulars. She'd owned Murphy's for 15 years, inheriting it from her late husband Sean, who'd passed from a heart attack while watching a Bengals game in this very establishment. "Another one, Pete?" Maggie called out, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd served thousands of drinks to thousands of stories. Pete shook his head slightly. "I'm good for now, Maggie. Thanks." The front door chimed as a young man entered, bringing with him a gust of the warm September air. Marcus Washington, 22, looked around nervously before approaching the bar. His khaki pants were pressed, his white button-down shirt clean, but obviously from a discount store. He carried himself with the careful posture of someone trying to make a good impression while fighting against years of feeling out of place in settings like this. "Excuse me," Marcus said to Maggie, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "I'm here about the server position. I called yesterday and spoke to someone who said I could come in tonight." Maggie looked up from her glass cleaning, sizing up the young man. "That was me you spoke to. Marcus, right? From over the Rhine?" "Yes, ma'am." Marcus straightened his shoulders. "I know I don't have restaurant experience, but I'm a hard worker. I just graduated from Cincinnati State with my associate's degree in business, and I'm looking for something while I figure out my next steps." Pete glanced over from his corner table, taking in the interaction with mild interest. He'd seen plenty of young people come and go from places like Murphy's over the years. Most lasted a few weeks before moving on to something better or giving up entirely. Maggie studied Marcus for a moment. The neighborhood had been changing rapidly over the past few years, with gentrification pushing long-time residents like Marcus and his family further from the opportunities downtown. She'd seen the struggle in the eyes of young men like him before, caught between a world that expected them to bootstrap their way to success and a system that seemed designed to keep them running in place. "Tell you what," Maggie said, setting down her towel. "We're not exactly fine dining here, but we serve good food and we treat people right. You think you can handle taking orders, carrying plates, and dealing with folks who've had a few too many?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. I've worked retail for 3 years at the Target on Coleraine. I know how to handle difficult customers." "Different kind of difficult here, son," chuckled Frank Morrison, a regular who'd been nursing the same whiskey for an hour. Frank worked construction and had the permanent sunburn and calloused hands to prove it. Drunk folks tend to be more creative with their complaints. Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression Pete had seen from him since he'd walked in. "I grew up with 3 older sisters and a single mom. I think I can handle creative complaints." This earned a laugh from several patrons, and Pete found himself smiling despite his usual preference for keeping to himself during his visits to Murphy's. Maggie extended her hand. "All right, Marcus Washington, you can start tomorrow night. 5 o'clock sharp. I'll have Danny show you the ropes." She gestured toward a stocky man in his 40s who was wiping down tables. "Pay is $8.50 an hour plus tips. Not much, but it's honest work. Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien. I really appreciate this opportunity." As Marcus shook Maggie's hand, Pete noticed the young man's genuine relief and gratitude. There was something in his demeanor that reminded Pete of his younger self, hungry, determined, but also carrying the weight of expectations and limited options. The door chimed again, and 3 men in expensive suits entered. Even before they spoke, their presence shifted the atmosphere in Murphy's. They carried themselves with the entitled swagger of men who were used to getting their way, their voices already raised in animated conversation about a business deal they'd apparently just closed. "This place'll do," announced the tallest of the 3, Bradley Chambers, a real estate developer who'd been buying up property in Over the Rhine for the past 2 years. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his navy suit probably cost more than most of Murphy's patrons made in a month. Authentic enough for the investors, but not so authentic that we'll get mugged walking back to the car. His companions laughed at what they apparently considered wit. James Henley, a city councilman with political ambitions that exceeded his actual influence, loosened his tie as he surveyed the bar. The third man, Robert Sterling, was Chambers' business partner and had the soft look of someone who'd never done a day of physical labor in his life. Pete's jaw tightened slightly. He dealt with men like these throughout his career, people who saw everything and everyone as either useful or disposable, with no middle ground for basic human decency. Maggie approached the newcomers with professional courtesy, though Pete noticed the subtle shift in her posture. "Evening, gentlemen." "Table or bar?" "Table," Chambers said without looking at her directly. "Somewhere we can talk business without the local color overhearing." Marcus, who had been preparing to leave after finalizing his employment details, paused near the door. The dismissive tone wasn't lost on him, nor on several other patrons who'd grown quiet. Maggie led them to a booth in the back corner, opposite from where Pete sat. As they settled in, their conversation immediately turned to their development plans for the neighborhood, their voices carrying despite their attempts at discretion. "The key is getting the remaining holdouts to sell," Sterling said, opening a leather portfolio. "Once we control the entire block, we can tear down these establishments and put up something that actually generates real tax revenue." Pete's grip tightened on his beer bottle. He'd grown up in a neighborhood not unlike this one, where local businesses were the heart of the community, not obstacles to be eliminated for profit. Marcus, who'd been heading for the door, stopped completely. Murphy's Tavern was 3 blocks from the apartment he shared with his mother and younger brother. If these men had their way, everything familiar in his world would disappear, replaced by boutique shops and restaurants he'd never be able to afford. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Maggie asked, her Irish accent slightly thicker than usual, a sign Pete had learned to recognize as barely controlled irritation. Chambers barely glanced at her. 3 whiskeys, top shelf, and make sure the glasses are actually clean." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Maggie's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her professionalism. Right away. As she walked back to the bar, Pete noticed the slight tremor in her hands, not from nerves, but from anger. In the 15 years she'd owned Murphy's, she'd built relationships with everyone from police officers to professors, creating a space where people from all walks of life could share a drink and conversation. The implication that her establishment was somehow beneath these men's standards was both personal and professional insult. Marcus remained frozen by the door, torn between leaving and what? He had no idea what he could possibly do about men with that kind of money and influence, but walking away felt like giving up before he'd even started fighting. Pete finished his beer and signaled Maggie for another. Something about the evening had shifted. and he had a feeling that his usual quiet drink was about to become something else entirely. He'd spent years learning to keep his head down, to avoid situations that might draw unwanted attention or criticism. But sometimes, despite your best intentions, situations find you anyway. The developers continued their conversation, their voices growing louder as they discussed displacement strategies and profit margins. Each word was another small cut to the people who called this neighborhood home, people like Marcus, who were just trying to build something better for themselves and their families. In his corner booth, Pete Rose sat with his fresh beer and watched the dynamics unfold. He'd been famous for his ability to read situations on the baseball field, to anticipate what was coming next, and position himself accordingly. Tonight, he could feel something building in the humid Cincinnati air, something that would test everyone in Murphy's Tavern in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that none of them expected, one that would reveal the true character of everyone involved and change the trajectory of their lives in ways both small and profound. Sometimes the most important games aren't played in stadiums, but in small taverns where ordinary people face extraordinary choices about who they really are and what they're willing to stand for. Marcus had almost made it to the door when Bradley Chambers' voice cut through the tavern's ambient noise like a blade. "Hey, kid!" The young man turned reluctantly, his hand still on the brass door handle worn smooth by decades of use. Every instinct told him to keep walking, to step out into the Cincinnati evening and pretend he hadn't heard the summons. But something in Chambers' tone, the casual entitlement, the assumption that he could command anyone's attention, made Marcus pause. "You work here?" Chambers asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I just got hired, sir," Marcus replied carefully, releasing the door handle and turning to face the table of developers. Sterling looked up from his portfolio with the expression of someone who just noticed an interesting specimen. "Perfect timing, then. We're going to need some service over here, and frankly, the old Irish woman seems a bit slow on the uptake." Pete's bottle stopped halfway to his lips. Across the bar, he saw Maggie's shoulders tense as she arranged glasses, her movements becoming deliberately precise, a sure sign that her temper was rising. Danny, the veteran server who'd been quietly wiping tables, stepped forward. "I can take care of you, gentlemen. What would you like?" Chambers waved him off dismissively. No, we want the new guy. Good for him to start earning his keep right away, don't you think?" The statement hung in the air with an undertone that made several patrons shift uncomfortably. Frank Morrison, the construction worker, looked up from his whiskey with narrowed eyes. At a nearby table, two university professors who'd been grading papers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. Marcus felt the weight of every gaze in Murphy's. This was his first night, his first impression, and these men were setting him up for something that felt wrong from the start, but he needed this job. His mother worked double shifts at Cincinnati General Hospital just to make rent on their small apartment, and his younger brother, Jason, was starting his senior year of high school with college aspirations that required someone in the family to have steady income. "Of course, sir," Marcus said, walking over to their table with what he hoped looked like professional confidence. "What can I get you?" "Finally," Chambers said, leaning back in the cracked vinyl booth. 3 top-shelf whiskeys. And make sure you know what top shelf means, kid. None of that rail garbage they probably serve the locals here. The casual racism was subtle but unmistakable. Pete's knuckles whitened around his beer bottle as he watched the young server's face remain carefully neutral despite the obvious insult. "We have Macallan 18, Pappy Van Winkle, and Jameson Gold," Marcus replied evenly. "Which would you prefer?" Henley, the city councilman, looked surprised. "Well, look at that. The kid actually knows his whiskey." "Don't sound so shocked, James," Sterling chuckled. "They've got to learn the inventory if they want to work in places like this. Though I have to ask, kid, how exactly does someone from your..." background, know about whiskey that costs more per bottle than you probably make in a week? Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, but his voice remained steady. I studied hospitality management as part of my business degree, sir. Part of the curriculum involved learning about different types of alcohol service. Business degree, Chambers repeated with amusement. From where? University of Cincinnati? Or was it one of those community colleges? Cincinnati State, Marcus replied, and immediately regretted providing more information than necessary. The three men exchanged looks that managed to be both knowing and condescending. Pete found himself leaning forward in his booth, his usual policy of non-interference beginning to crack under the pressure of what he was witnessing. Cincinnati State, Henley mused. Well, that explains a lot. Tell me, what exactly does a business degree from Cincinnati State qualify you to do besides serve drinks to your betters? The word betters landed like a slap across the quiet tavern. Danny stopped wiping tables altogether. Maggie turned around at the bar, her Irish eyes flashing with dangerous fire. Even the college students at their corner table looked up from their textbooks with expressions of disbelief. Marcus stood perfectly still for a moment, his mind racing through responses that ranged from dignified to devastating. But each scenario ended the same way, with him losing a job he desperately needed in a neighborhood that was already being systematically dismantled by men exactly like these. It qualifies me to understand that customer service means treating people with respect, sir, Marcus said finally, his voice calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Now, would you like the Macallan, the Pappy, or the Jameson? Sterling laughed outright. Oh, this one's got some backbone, I like that. Tell you what, kid, bring us the Pappy. And since you're so educated, why don't you explain to us what makes it worth $40 a glass? Pete watched as Marcus's jaw worked silently for a moment. The young man was trapped in an impossible situation. He could either perform like a trained SEAL for these men's amusement, or he could maintain his dignity and likely lose his job before he'd even officially started. From behind the bar, Maggie's voice cut through the tension. Marcus, honey, why don't you let me handle this table? Danny can show you how to work the register. But Chambers held up a hand. No. We specifically requested the new boy. He can handle it. Can't you, son? The patronizing use of son was the final straw for several people in Murphy's. Frank Morrison pushed back from his table with a scrape of chair legs against worn linoleum. The two professors closed their books with sharp snaps. And in his corner booth, Pete Rose set down his beer with the deliberate motion of a man who just made a decision he'd been avoiding. Marcus took a deep breath, and Pete could see him gathering himself for whatever came next. The young server's voice, when it came, was steady and professional despite everything. Pappy Van Winkle is aged for 15 years in charred oak barrels, Marcus began, his business education evident in his precise explanation. It's made from a wheated bourbon recipe that creates a smoother flavor profile than rye-based bourbons. The distillery produces limited quantities each year, which contributes to its premium pricing and reputation among collectors. Very good, Chambers said with mock applause. See, James, give them a little education and they can parrot back the basics. Now here's what I want you to do, kid. When you bring our drinks, I want you to tell us about your plans for bettering yourself. Because surely you don't intend to spend your life serving people in places like this. The question was loaded with implications that made Pete's stomach turn. He'd heard similar comments throughout his career. The assumption that some people deserved success while others deserved to serve, and that the difference was somehow natural and inevitable rather than the result of systems and circumstances. Marcus nodded curtly and walked back to the bar, where Maggie was already preparing their order. Her movements were sharp, with barely contained anger. You don't have to put up with that, you know, she said quietly as she poured the expensive whiskey into 3 glasses. Yes, I do, Marcus replied, his voice steady but strained. At least for tonight. Pete stood up from his booth, leaving money on the table for his drinks. As he walked toward the bar, conversations gradually quieted throughout Murphy's. Everyone knew who he was, though most had the courtesy to pretend otherwise during his regular visits. "Evening, Pete," Maggie said, her tone grateful for any interruption to the tension that had been building. "Evening, Maggie. Busy night?" "Getting busier by the minute," she replied with a meaningful glance toward the developer's table. Pete turned to Marcus, who was arranging the 3 glasses of Pappy Van Winkle on a small tray. "First night?" "Yes, sir." "Nervous?" Marcus paused in his preparations, looking up at the man who'd been quietly occupying the corner booth all evening. There was something in Pete's weathered face that suggested understanding born from experience. "A little," Marcus admitted, "but I need this job." Pete nodded slowly. "We all need something. Question is what we're willing to trade away to get it." Before Marcus could respond, Chambers' voice boomed across the tavern again. "Hey! Are those drinks coming? Or are you having a social hour over there?" Marcus picked up the tray, his knuckles showing white against his dark skin as he gripped the edges. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. Pete watched the young man walk back toward the developer's table, and something crystallized in his mind. For years, he'd been trying to rehabilitate his reputation through quiet charity work, community appearances, and careful public statements. He'd learned to avoid controversy, to keep his head down, to let his actions speak quietly rather than making waves. But sometimes, Pete realized keeping quiet was its own form of action, and not the kind he could live with. At the developer's table, Marcus set down the 3 glasses with professional precision, despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "3 Pappy Van Winkle, gentlemen." "Excellent," Chambers said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "Now, as I was asking before, tell us about your plans to better yourself. Surely a young man with a business degree has bigger ambitions than working in a neighborhood dive bar." The casual cruelty of the question wasn't lost on anyone in Murphy's. It was designed to humiliate not just Marcus, but everyone who'd ever worked honest jobs in places like this. It reduced Maggie's life work to something shameful, dismissed the relationships and community that had been built within these walls, and demanded that Marcus either validate their prejudices or defend himself in a way that would inevitably sound defensive. Marcus stood beside their table, tray in hand, and Pete could see him wrestling with the impossible choice these men had forced upon him. The young server's next words would set the tone for everything that followed, and Pete realized that he couldn't just sit in his corner booth and watch it happen. The moment had arrived when good people had to choose between safety and principle, between keeping quiet and speaking up, between letting injustice pass unremarked or standing up to be counted. And Pete Rose, despite all his past mistakes and carefully cultivated desire to avoid controversy, found himself walking across the worn linoleum floor of Murphy's Tavern toward a confrontation that would define more than just one evening's interaction. The catalyst had been lit, and the explosion was only seconds away. Marcus opened his mouth to respond to Chambers' loaded question, but before he could speak, a shadow fell across the developer's table. Pete Rose stood beside their booth, his presence somehow filling more space than his medium frame should have commanded. "Evening, gentlemen," Pete said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd spent decades performing under pressure. "Enjoying your drinks?" Chambers looked up with mild annoyance, clearly not recognizing the interruption. "Fine, thanks. We're having a private conversation here." "Oh, I noticed," Pete replied, pulling out the empty chair at the end of their booth and sitting down uninvited. "Couldn't help but overhear some of it. You fellows mind if I join you for a minute?" The 3 developers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. There was something in Pete's demeanor that suggested this wasn't a request, despite the polite phrasing. Henley, the city councilman, squinted at Pete with the look of someone trying to place a familiar face. Do we know you from somewhere? Maybe, Pete said with a slight smile. I've lived in Cincinnati my whole life, spent a lot of time in places like Murphy's over the years. Sterling leaned forward, his business instincts kicking in. Are you a property owner in the neighborhood? Because if so, we might have some opportunities that would interest you. In a manner of speaking, Pete replied. I own a piece of Cincinnati's history, you might say. Just like Maggie here owns a piece of this neighborhood's heart. He gestured toward the bar, where the proprietor was watching the interaction with barely concealed fascination. Marcus remained standing beside the table, tray still in hand, unsure whether to stay or retreat. The dynamic had shifted completely with Pete's arrival, but he couldn't yet tell whether the change was good or dangerous. Chambers took a sip of his Pappy Van Winkle and grimaced slightly. Whether at the taste or the interruption, it was hard to tell. Look, Mr. Pete, we appreciate Cincinnati's colorful characters, but we're in the middle of a business discussion. Perhaps you could find another table. Pete's smile widened but didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I think this is exactly where I need to be. See, I heard you asking my young friend here about his plans to better himself. That's an interesting question coming from men who make their living tearing down the things other people built. The temperature in Murphy's seemed to drop several degrees. At surrounding tables, conversations had ceased entirely as patrons strained to listen. This wasn't the usual Tuesday night entertainment they'd come to expect. I beg your pardon, Sterling said, his voice carrying warning. We're legitimate businessmen engaged in urban development. We create jobs, increase property values, and improve neighborhoods. For who? Pete asked, his tone remaining conversational despite the edge in his words. Because from what I heard, your plan involves forcing out people like Maggie, people like Marcus here, people who've been part of this community for years. That doesn't sound like improvement to me. That sounds like replacement. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. This stranger, this regular customer he'd barely noticed, was saying everything Marcus had been thinking but couldn't afford to voice. The young server found himself caught between gratitude and terror at the potential consequences of Pete's intervention. Henley set down his glass with a sharp click. Now listen here, whoever you are. You don't understand the complexities of urban planning and economic development. Sometimes change is necessary for the greater good. Greater good, Pete repeated thoughtfully. That's interesting language from a city councilman. Tell me, James. It is James, right? When you say greater good, whose good exactly are we talking about? The use of his first name caught Henley off guard. How did you know your name? I make it my business to know the people who make decisions about my city. Just like I know that Robert Sterling there has been buying up properties in Over the Rhine for 2 years, often targeting elderly homeowners who can't afford to fight legal challenges. And Bradley Chambers has a habit of promising community benefits that somehow never materialize once the construction contracts are signed. The three men stared at Pete with a mixture of shock and growing alarm. This wasn't the random local they'd assumed him to be. Chambers recovered first, his business instincts kicking in. All right, you've done your homework. Impressive. But that doesn't change the economic reality of urban development. These neighborhoods need investment and modernization. Do they? Pete asked, looking around Murphy's with genuine affection. This place has been serving the community for 30 years. Maggie employs local people, buys from local suppliers, provides a space where everyone from professors to construction workers can share a drink and conversation. What exactly needs fixing about that? Sterling leaned forward aggressively. What needs fixing is the property tax base, the crime statistics, the general atmosphere of areas like this. We're trying to create something better. Better for who, though? Pete pressed. Because I'm looking at Marcus here, a young man with a college degree who just got hired for honest work. I'm looking at Maggie, who's built relationships with hundreds of people over the years, creating exactly the kind of community spaces that cities need. I'm looking at Danny over there, who's been serving folks in this neighborhood for a decade and knows everyone's story. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the three developers. Then I look at you three and I see people who want to erase all of that and replace it with what? Generic restaurants that none of these folks can afford. Boutique shops selling $40 candles. Luxury apartments that cost more per month than most people here make. Marcus found himself nodding involuntarily. This was exactly the fear that kept him awake at night, watching his neighborhood disappear piece by piece, replaced by a version of itself that had no place for people like him. Chambers' face was reddening with a combination of alcohol and anger. You know what your problem is, Pete. You're living in the past. The world changes, and people need to change with it or get left behind. That's just reality. Reality, Pete repeated slowly. Let me tell you about reality. Reality is working your ass off for everything you get. Reality is treating people with respect, regardless of what neighborhood they come from or what kind of work they do. Reality is understanding that communities aren't just real estate investments. They're where people live their lives, raise their families, build their dreams. He gestured toward Marcus. This young man worked his way through college while helping support his family. He shows up here tonight looking for honest work, and instead of getting the basic courtesy every human being deserves, he gets treated like entertainment for your amusement. That's not reality. That's just cruelty disguised as business. The tavern had gone completely silent, except for the hum of the old refrigerator behind the bar and the distant sound of traffic on Race Street. Every patron was riveted by the confrontation unfolding before them. Henley tried to regain control of the situation. Look, we don't need to be lectured by some barfly about economic development. Barfly? Pete's voice carried a hint of amusement now. That's interesting. Tell me, James, what exactly do you think qualifies someone to lecture others about work ethic and community values? Before Henley could respond, Frank Morrison spoke up from his table across the room. Hey, buddy, he called to Henley. You might want to watch how you talk to Pete Rose. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sterling's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Chambers' eyes widened as recognition finally dawned. Henley's mouth opened and closed without sound. Pete smiled slightly, acknowledging Frank's intervention with a small nod. Thanks, Frank. Though I'd prefer to be judged by how I treat people tonight rather than what I did on a baseball field 40 years ago. The revelation had shifted everything in Murphy's Tavern. Suddenly, the three developers were no longer confronting some random local with an opinion. They were facing down Charlie Hustle himself, a Cincinnati legend whose name was synonymous with the city's sports history. But more than that, they were facing a man who'd spent years dealing with public scrutiny, who understood the weight of reputation and the importance of standing up when it mattered. Pete Rose had made his share of mistakes, but he'd never been accused of backing down from a fight when he believed he was right. Marcus stared at his unlikely defender with new understanding. This wasn't just any customer stepping in. This was someone whose name would be remembered long after the developer's business deals were forgotten. And he was using that influence to defend a 22-year-old server he'd never met before tonight. The confrontation was far from over, but the ground had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Pete Rose had chosen his side, and in doing so, he'd transformed what might have been a private humiliation into a very public statement about values, respect, and what it really meant to better yourself and your community. The question now was how far each side was willing to push and what price they were prepared to pay for their principles. The silence that followed Frank Morrison's revelation stretched like a taut wire through Murphy's Tavern. Bradley Chambers stared at Pete with the expression of a man who just realized he'd been playing poker with marked cards and was only now seeing the dealer's hands clearly. Pete Rose, Sterling said slowly, as if testing the words. The Pete rose. "Just Pete tonight," he replied, though his posture had subtly changed, not defensive, but more centered, like a batter who'd found his stance. "Same Pete who was enjoying a quiet drink until you gentlemen decided to turn this young man's first night of work into your personal entertainment." Henley had gone pale, his political instincts finally kicking in as he realized the potential ramifications of the confrontation. In Cincinnati, insulting Pete Rose was like insulting the city itself, a career-limiting move for someone with electoral ambitions. "Mr. Rose," Henley began carefully, "I think there may have been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Pete interrupted. "I heard exactly what you said to Marcus. I saw exactly how you treated Maggie. I watched you three walk into a neighborhood institution and immediately start calculating how to tear it down for your own profit." Marcus remained frozen beside the table, tray clutched in his hands, watching the most famous athlete in Cincinnati's history defend his dignity against men who probably made more in a month than Pete's current income. The surreal nature of the situation hadn't escaped him, but neither had the genuine anger in Pete's voice when he talked about respect and community. Behind the bar, Maggie had abandoned all pretense of working and was watching the drama unfold with the fascination of someone seeing justice served in real time. Danny had moved closer, ostensibly to clean tables, but really to provide backup if the situation turned physical. Chambers finished his whiskey in one gulp, trying to buy time to think. As a developer, he was used to dealing with obstacles, zoning boards, community activists, property owners who needed persuasion to sell. But facing down a beloved local legend who'd clearly decided to make a stand was uncharted territory. "Look, Mr. Rose," Chambers said, attempting to project calm authority. "We're all Cincinnati natives here. We all want what's best for the city. Sometimes that means making tough choices about progress versus nostalgia." Pete leaned back in his chair, studying the three men with the analytical gaze that had once allowed him to read pitches and steal bases with uncanny precision. Progress versus nostalgia, that's one way to look at it. Another way might be community versus profit, or people versus property values. He gestured around Murphy's, taking in the faded photographs, the worn booths, the faces of patrons who'd been coming here for years. "You see nostalgia, I see history. You see a building that could be torn down for something more profitable. I see a place where people have celebrated victories, mourned losses, found friendship and built relationships." "But surely you understand," Sterling interjected, "that economic development requires some disruption. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs." The cliché landed wrong in the charged atmosphere of Murphy's. Pete's expression hardened. "Interesting metaphor. The eggs get broken, the omelette gets eaten, and somehow the people who do the breaking always seem to be the ones who profit from the eating." Marcus found his voice for the first time since Pete had sat down. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but could I ask you gentlemen something?" All eyes turned to the young server, who'd been the catalyst for the entire confrontation, but had largely been spoken around, rather than to, since Pete's arrival. "Of course," Pete said encouragingly. Marcus looked directly at the three developers. "You asked me about my plans to better myself. I'd like to know what you think better means." Chambers, Henley, and Sterling exchanged uncertain glances. The question seemed simple, but the context made it dangerous. "Well," Henley said carefully, "success, advancement, making something of yourself." "By leaving this neighborhood," Marcus pressed, "by turning my back on places like Murphy's and people like Mrs. O'Brien? By pretending that where I come from is something to be ashamed of rather than proud of?" The directness of the question caught the developers off guard. They'd expected defensive responses or gratitude for their attention, not this articulate challenge to their assumptions. "I got my degree by studying nights and weekends while working full-time at Target," Marcus continued, his confidence growing as he spoke. My mother works double shifts at the hospital to help pay for my brother's college applications. My family has lived in Over the Rhine for 3 generations. We've seen the neighborhood go through hard times and good times, but we've never seen ourselves as problems to be solved by people who don't live here. Pete nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. You want to know what bettering yourself really looks like. It looks like getting an education while supporting your family. It looks like showing up for honest work and treating people with dignity. It looks like understanding that your community isn't a stepping stone to somewhere else. It's worth investing in and improving right where it is. Sterling attempted to regain control of the conversation. That's all very noble, but it doesn't change economic realities. Properties in transitional neighborhoods represent opportunities for growth and improvement. We're not the villains here. We're investors bringing capital and development to areas that need both. Need according to who? Asked Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the professors who'd been grading papers at a corner table. She'd been listening to the entire exchange with growing interest, and now felt compelled to join the discussion. I teach urban planning at UC, and I can tell you that community displacement in the name of improvement has a long and troubling history in American cities. Her intervention surprised everyone, including Pete. The conversation was expanding beyond the original confrontation into something larger, a real-time debate about gentrification, community values, and what progress actually meant. Chambers turned toward Dr. Chen with obvious frustration. With all due respect, Professor, academic theory and business reality are 2 different things. We can't preserve every rundown bar and corner store in the name of community character. Run down? Maggie's Irish accent thickened with indignation as she stepped out from behind the bar. I'll have you know that Murphy's has been serving this community faithfully for 3 decades. We've hosted fundraisers for families in crisis, provided jobs for people who needed second chances, and created a space where everyone is welcome, regardless of their bank account. She gestured toward the wall of photographs showing Murphy's hosting charity events, birthday celebrations, and community gatherings. You call that rundown? I call it lived in. I call it loved. Frank Morrison pushed back his chair and stood up, his weathered construction worker's frame imposing even in the dim tavern light. Ma'am's got a point. I've been coming here for 8 years ever since my divorce. This place kept me sane when I didn't think I had anywhere else to go. Other patrons began to murmur agreement. The college students closed their textbooks entirely, recognizing that they were witnessing something more educational than anything in their assignments. An elderly couple who'd been quietly sharing dessert nodded along with Frank's words. Pete watched the organic support building around Marcus and Maggie with satisfaction. This was what he'd hoped for. Not just his intervention, but the community standing up for itself. You see, Pete said to the developers, this is what you don't understand about places like Murphy's. It's not just a business, it's infrastructure, social infrastructure. It serves needs that your boutique restaurants and luxury apartments can't serve, needs that matter just as much as profit margins. Henley, sweating now despite the evening's cooling temperature, tried another approach. Mr. Rose, surely you of all people understand competition and winning. In business as in sports, there are winners and losers. That's just how the game works. Pete's laugh was short and sharp. You want to talk about winning and losing? Let me tell you something about competition, James. Real competition is about bringing out the best in everyone involved. What you're describing isn't competition, it's displacement. You're not trying to be better than Murphy's. You're trying to make sure Murphy's can't exist at all. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity that had once driven him to break records. In baseball, when I stole a base, the other team still had a chance to throw me out. When I got a hit, the pitcher could strike me out next time. That's competition. But you're not trying to outcompete Maggie's business. You're trying to make it illegal for her business to exist in the first place. Marcus set his tray down on the table with a soft click, a gesture that somehow carried the weight of decision. Can I tell you what I think would actually improve this neighborhood? Sterling waved dismissively. Sure, kid. Let's hear your urban planning expertise. The condescension in his tone was so thick that several patrons visibly recoiled. Pete's eyes flashed dangerously, but he held his tongue, recognizing that Marcus needed to speak for himself. Better bus connections to downtown job centers, Marcus said without hesitation. More small business loans for local entrepreneurs. After-school programs that don't require parents to pay fees they can't afford. Community college partnerships that let working people get training without leaving their neighborhoods. His voice gained strength as he continued. Investment in the people who are already here, instead of replacing them with people who have more money. Improvement that builds up rather than tears down. The specificity and thoughtfulness of his response created another moment of silence in Murphy's. These weren't vague complaints or wishful thinking. They were concrete policy suggestions from someone who actually lived with the consequences of urban development decisions. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. Those are exactly the kinds of interventions that research shows actually improve communities long-term. The literature is quite clear that displacement-based development creates more problems than it solves. Chambers' face had grown progressively redder throughout the evening, and now his composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. We're being lectured about business by a washed-up ball player, a bartender, some kid who serves drinks, and a professor who's never had to meet a payroll in her life. The insults hit the room like thrown punches. Pete stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum. His movement was controlled, deliberate, and somehow more threatening than any aggressive gesture could have been. Washed-up ball player, Pete repeated quietly. That's interesting. Tell me, Bradley, what exactly have you built that will be remembered 40 years from now? What records have you set that people will still talk about when you're gone? He gestured around Murphy's again. Maggie built this. A place where people feel welcome, where communities form, where someone like Marcus can get a chance to prove himself. That's a legacy. That's something worth defending. His voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the tavern. You want to know what's washed up? It's the idea that profit justifies cruelty. It's the belief that some people matter more than others based on their zip code or their bank balance. It's the assumption that progress means erasing the past instead of building on it. Marcus felt a surge of emotion that surprised him with its intensity. He'd never had anyone defend him like this, certainly not someone with Pete Rose's stature and history. But more than that, he was witnessing someone use their privilege and influence not for personal gain, but to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. The confrontation had evolved beyond the original slight into something much larger, a clash of worldviews about community, respect, and what American success really meant. And somehow, in a modest Irish tavern in Cincinnati, Pete Rose had become the unlikely champion of values that transcended baseball, business, or personal reputation. The evening was far from over, and the most profound moments were yet to come. The tension in Murphy's tavern had reached a breaking point when Chambers made his fatal mistake. Standing up abruptly, he knocked over his whiskey glass, sending the expensive Pappy Van Winkle spreading across the scarred wooden table. You know what? Chambers snarled, pointing an unsteady finger at Pete. I don't give a damn who you think you are. This whole neighborhood is going to change whether you like it or not. And people like him, he gestured dismissively toward Marcus, are going to have to learn their place in the new order. The phrase, learn their place, landed like a physical blow in the suddenly silent tavern. It was a line too far, even for men who'd been testing boundaries all evening. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the ugly assumptions that had been driving their behavior from the start. Pete moved faster than anyone expected, stepping between Chambers and Marcus with the fluid motion of someone who'd spent decades reacting to split-second situations. But instead of the physical confrontation everyone expected, he simply stood there, letting the weight of his presence and reputation fill the space. "Say that again," Pete said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was more frightening than shouting. "I want to make sure everyone in here heard you correctly." Chambers, emboldened by alcohol and frustrated by the evening's unexpected resistance, made the mistake of doubling down. "You heard me. These people need to understand that Cincinnati is changing. The old ways, the old neighborhoods, the old demographics are going to be improved, whether they like it or not." The racial undertone was unmistakable now, and it hung in the air like poison gas. "Doctor." Chen stood up from her table, her academic composure replaced by obvious disgust. Frank Morrison took a step forward, his construction workers' hands clenched into fists. Even the college students looked ready to intervene. But it was Maggie who spoke first, her Irish voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Get out," she said simply, stepping out from behind the bar with 30 years of proprietorship behind her words. "Get out of my pub, right now." Sterling attempted damage control. "Now, Mrs. O'Brien, I think we can all calm down." "No," Maggie interrupted, her accent thickening with emotion. "No, we cannot all calm down. You came into my establishment, insulted my employee, disrespected my customers, and now you've shown your true colors. You're not welcome here. Leave." Henley, recognizing the political disaster unfolding before him, tried desperately to salvage the situation. "Mr. Rose, surely we can discuss this like civilized adults." "Civilized adults," Pete repeated, his voice heavy with irony. "James, civilized adults don't treat service workers like entertainment. Civilized adults don't walk into someone else's neighborhood and immediately start planning how to destroy it. And civilized adults sure as hell don't tell people they need to learn their place." He turned to address the entire tavern, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded stadiums full of fans. "I want everyone to remember what you heard tonight. These men didn't accidentally reveal their prejudices. They've been showing them all evening. The only difference is they finally said out loud what they'd been thinking the whole time." Marcus found his voice, stronger now than it had been all evening. "Mr. Chambers, Mr. Sterling, Mr. Henley, you asked me about my plans to better myself. Let me answer that question properly." He stepped forward, no longer the nervous young man who'd walked into Murphy's hours earlier. "I plan to better myself by getting my bachelor's degree while working jobs like this one. I plan to better myself by supporting my family and contributing to my community. I plan to better myself by treating every person I meet with the respect and dignity you couldn't show me tonight." Indeed, his voice gained strength as he continued. "But most importantly, I plan to better myself by never becoming the kind of person who thinks their success requires other people's failure. I plan to never become the kind of person who looks at a place like Murphy's and sees something to be destroyed instead of something to be valued." The power of his words seemed to surprise even Marcus himself, but they rang with sincerity and conviction that couldn't be faked. Pete nodded approvingly, recognizing leadership when he saw it. Danny, who'd been quietly supportive all evening, stepped forward with a damp towel. "Let me clean up this spill for you, gentlemen. Wouldn't want you to slip on your way out." The pointed suggestion wasn't lost on anyone. The three developers found themselves surrounded by the quiet but unmistakable solidarity of Murphy's patrons. They weren't being threatened exactly, but they were definitely being invited to leave. Chambers, Sterling, and Henley gathered their papers and briefcases with as much dignity as they could muster, but the damage to their evening and their egos was complete. As they prepared to leave, Chambers turned back, for one final attempt at dominance. "This isn't over," he said, directed primarily at Pete. "We have legitimate business interests in this neighborhood." Pete smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Bradley, let me give you some free advice. I've spent the last 30 years learning what happens when you let your worst impulses override your better judgment. The consequences tend to stick around a lot longer than you expect." He gestured around Murphy's, taking in the faces of people who'd witnessed the evening's drama. "You've got a room full of witnesses who just heard you show your true character. Dr. Chen there teaches urban planning. She'll probably mention tonight in her classes. Frank works construction all over the city. He'll tell his crew about the developers who insulted working people. These college students will post about it on social media before they get home." The truth of Pete's words was evident in the faces around the tavern. The developers had thought they were dealing with powerless people in an anonymous setting, but they'd miscalculated completely. Their behavior tonight would follow them. "And Marcus here," Pete continued, "he's going to remember that when people with power chose to demean him, other people stepped up to defend his dignity. That's the kind of lesson that shapes someone's entire approach to leadership." As if to prove Pete's point, Dr. Chen approached the developers with a business card. "Mr. Henley, I'll be discussing tonight's conversation in my urban development class next week. If you'd like to present your side of the story, you're welcome to attend. Though I should mention that several of my students were here tonight and witnessed everything firsthand." Henley took the card with a shaking hand, realizing that his political career might have just taken a devastating hit in the most unlikely of venues. The three men finally made their exit, leaving Murphy's Tavern feeling somehow larger and brighter despite their absence. The normal sounds of conversation gradually returned, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally changed by what everyone had witnessed. Pete turned to Marcus, extending his hand. "That was well said, son. You've got leadership in you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Marcus shook the offered hand, still somewhat stunned by the evening's events. "Thank you, Mr. Rose. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." "You would have figured it out," Pete replied confidently. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not the way it happened, but you would have figured it out. Men like that count on people feeling isolated and powerless. The secret is remembering that you're never as alone as they want you to believe." Maggie approached with a fresh beer for Pete and a genuine smile for Marcus. "Well, Marcus Washington, that was quite an introduction to Murphy's Tavern. Think you can handle working here after tonight?" Marcus looked around the tavern, at the faded photographs, the worn booths, the faces of people who'd just demonstrated what community really meant, and smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I think this is exactly where I belong." Dr. Chen gathered her papers, but paused before leaving. "Marcus, if you're interested in continuing your education, UC has some excellent graduate programs in business and urban planning. After what I witnessed tonight, I think you'd bring a valuable perspective to either field." "Thank you, Professor. I'll definitely consider that." As the evening wound down and patrons began to drift home, Pete found himself back in his corner booth. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Instead of the solitary contemplation he'd sought when he arrived, he was surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing at the right moment. Frank Morrison stopped by Pete's table before leaving. "Hell of a thing tonight, Pete. Reminded me why I've always been proud to be from Cincinnati." "Just returning the favor, Frank? This city's been good to me, even when I didn't deserve it." As closing time approached, Marcus efficiently helped Danny clean up while Maggie counted the till. The routine tasks felt different now, not like drudgery, but like participation in something worthwhile. "Marcus," Maggie called as she locked the register, "tomorrow I want you to meet with our food distributor. Danny's been handling procurement, but I think it's time we had someone with business education take a look at our operations. Interested in some additional responsibility?" "Absolutely, Mrs. O'Brien. Pete finished his beer and prepared to leave, but Marcus approached him one final time. "Mr. Rose, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you stand up for me tonight? You didn't know me, and getting involved could have caused you problems." Pete considered the question seriously. "You know, Marcus, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. Some of them very public, very costly mistakes. But I learned something from all of that. Your reputation isn't really about what people say about you when you're successful. It's about who you choose to be when nobody's watching, or when standing up costs you something." He stood and put on his jacket, a windbreaker that had seen better days. Tonight, choosing to be the kind of person I want to be happened to align with choosing to defend someone who deserved defending. Sometimes life gives you those opportunities, and you have to decide whether to take them or let them pass. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. "For taking it." Pete smiled, and this time the warmth reached his eyes. "Thank you for being worth defending." As Pete walked toward the door, he paused at the wall of photographs showing Murphy's Tavern's history, community events, celebrations, and the faces of people who'd found belonging within these walls. Tomorrow, he knew, there would be new stories to tell about what had happened here tonight. Outside, Cincinnati's evening air carried the promise of autumn, and Pete Rose walked home through neighborhoods where his legend had been built and sometimes tarnished, but ultimately redeemed by moments exactly like this one. Behind him, Murphy's Tavern prepared for another day of serving its community, now with a young server who'd learned that dignity was worth defending, and a proprietor who'd been reminded why she'd chosen this life in the first place. The story that began with casual cruelty had ended with authentic community, and everyone involved had been changed by the experience in ways they were only beginning to understand. In a city built on sports legends and working-class values, Pete Rose had added another chapter to his complicated legacy, not on a baseball field, but in a neighborhood tavern where ordinary people faced extraordinary choices about who they really wanted to be. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to choose between what's easy and what's right. But for one night in Murphy's Tavern, the right choice had been made by enough people to matter, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the walls of a single Irish pub in Cincinnati, Ohio. Sometimes the most important games aren't played in stadiums, but in the small moments when ordinary people decide to stand up for each other, proving that the real measure of character isn't what you achieve when everyone's watching, but what you do when someone needs defending and you're the only one positioned to help. In Murphy's Tavern, Pete Rose had reminded everyone, including himself, what it really meant to be a champion.